Eleanor Hayes pressed her last silver dollar into the auctioneer's palm while the entire town of Red Valley laughed at her. The stallion behind her was screaming, throwing himself against the fence boards hard enough to splinter wood. Blood on his shoulder from where the last man had tried to rope him down and failed. 3 ranch hands were still limping from yesterday, and this woman, this dirt-poor widow in a worn brown dress with no saddle, no rifle, and no one standing beside her just said, "He's mine now." If you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what Eleanor did next is something I promise you have never seen before. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The summer of 1882 did not arrive gently in Red Valley, Wyoming. It came in hard the way most things came to frontier towns, without warning and without apology. The kind of heat that cracked the mud along the main road into pale, dry plates and turned the water trough outside the general store into something barely worth calling water. The kind of summer that made men short-tempered and made animals dangerous, and made everyone who had any sense stay indoors until the worst of the afternoon had passed. It was into this heat that Eleanor Hayes walked. She came on foot because she no longer had a horse of her own. She came from the East Road because that was the direction she had been traveling when the last of her money ran out and the last of her strength nearly ran out with it. She carried one bag, brown leather cracked along the handle, held together at one corner, with a strip of rawhide she had tied herself somewhere back in Nebraska. Inside that bag was everything she still owned in the world. One change of clothes, a small Bible with her husband's name written inside the front cover, a folding knife, and $1 silver. That was it. That was the total sum of Eleanor Hayes at 31 years old. She walked into Red Valley the way a woman walks when she is too tired to be afraid anymore. Not with her chin high, that would have been performance, and Eleanor had no energy left for performance. She walked with her eyes steady and her shoulders square because those were the only 2 things she could still control. Her dress was the color of old creek water, somewhere between brown and nothing, and the hem was dark with road dust up to her knee. Her boots had been resoled once already and were starting to come apart again at the left toe, and she could feel every stone in the road through the thin leather. People noticed her. People in small frontier towns always noticed a stranger, and they noticed a woman stranger faster than any other kind. She felt their eyes from the moment she stepped off the East Road and onto the main street. Men on porch steps, women hanging washing who paused with their arms still raised. A group of boys who had been chasing a dog stopped running and stood in a row watching her pass. She did not nod at them. She did not smile. She kept walking because stopping meant she had arrived, and arriving meant deciding what came next, and she wasn't quite ready for that yet. What she needed was water. What she found instead was a crowd. There were maybe 40 people gathered at the far end of the main street, near the wide fence enclosure behind Hannigan's Feed and Supply. Eleanor could hear the noise before she could see the source of it. Men shouting boots, stomping against the fence rails, the particular sharp crack of wood under extraordinary force. She could hear the animal too. Even from a block away she could hear him. Not just hoofbeats. Not just the snort and blow of an upset horse. Something rawer than that. Something that cut through the crowd noise and the heat and the distance, and landed directly in Eleanor's chest like a stone thrown into still water. She changed direction without deciding to. Her feet carried her toward the sound before her mind had finished forming the thought, and she moved through the edges of the crowd the way water moves through gaps in rock, not forcing anything, just finding the space that was already there. Men shifted without looking at her. She worked her way to the fence and gripped the top rail and looked through. The horse was black, not dark brown, not dark bay black. The way midnight is black when there is no moon and no stars, and the sky is just a solid wall of nothing. He was large, larger than the horses she had grown up with back in Ohio, with a chest that looked like it had been built for a different, harder world than this one. His mane was tangled and there was sweat darkening his neck and shoulders. And his eyes were white-rimmed and rolling and full of something that Eleanor recognized immediately. Not rage, terror. The horse was terrified. Everything that looked like fury from the outside, the throwing, the striking, the crashing against the fence, until the boards shook, was fear. She had known enough frightened horses in her life to know the difference, and the difference was not subtle if you knew how to look. A horse with rage in him has a different energy than a horse with terror in him. Rage is hot and focused and goes somewhere. Terror just circles. It eats itself. It makes the animal look mad because there is nowhere for the panic to go, so it comes out as violence, and everyone watching sees the violence and calls it danger, when what it actually is pain. Eleanor held onto the fence rail and watched him circle. "That's Thunder," said a man standing to her left without her asking. He was heavy-set with a canvas vest and a tobacco stain along his lower lip, and he spoke with the satisfied authority of someone delivering news they enjoy delivering. "Walker's horse. Finest bloodlines in 3 counties, they say. Can't do a damn thing with him, though. Throwed 6 men in the first month. Put 2 of them in bed for a week. Yesterday he got loose in the smaller pen and put his shoe right through Hicks's shoulder. Hicks is over at the docks now." "What happened to him?" Eleanor said. The man looked at her sideways. "I just told you what happened. He put Hicks through the—" "No," she said. "What happened to the horse?" The man looked at her the way men looked at women who asked questions that didn't make sense to them. "Nothing happened to him. He's just mean. Some of them are just mean." Eleanor did not argue. She turned her attention back to the pen. The horse had stopped his circling for a moment and stood in the far corner sides, heaving head low. There was a rope trailing from his halter. Someone had tried to get a lead on him and lost hold, and now the rope lay in the dirt, and nobody was going in after it. Along his left shoulder below the sweat, she could see old scarring. Not the thin white lines of normal fence scrapes or the occasional mark that came with ordinary handling. These were the layered, puckered kind. The kind that came from something applied repeatedly over time. Eleanor's jaw tightened. She heard someone talking behind her, and turned enough to see a man making his way to the center of the space in front of the crowd. He was maybe 50, with a good hat and a good coat, and the kind of posture that came with years of other people stepping aside to let you through. His face was not unkind, but it was a face that had learned to keep its own counsel, and the lines around his mouth suggested he had been keeping it for a long time. He was flanked by a man Eleanor would later know as Caleb Stone, lean and watchful, with the look of someone who was always calculating something just behind his eyes. "All right," the man in the good coat said, and the crowd settled in the way crowds settle for someone whose words they take seriously. "I think most of you know the situation by now. Thunder isn't going to be rideable. I've come to that conclusion, and I've come to it after a considerable amount of trying otherwise. What I'm looking to do today is find him a buyer who might have better luck than I've had, or—" He paused and his jaw tightened slightly. "Or we discuss the alternative." Someone in the crowd said, "What's the price?" "Fair price," the man said. "Given everything." "You want to put him down, Mr. Walker, we understand." A woman's voice called from somewhere to Eleanor's right. "It ain't worth a man's life trying to break what can't be broke." Nathan Walker. Because Eleanor knew by then it must be him, this was clearly his horse, and his decision did not answer that immediately. He looked toward the pen, where Thunder had begun his circling again, and something moved across Nathan Walker's face that he did not quite manage to hide. Something that looked just briefly like it cost him something. "I'm not there yet," he said quietly. "I'd rather find another way." $20? Someone called. 10 called someone else, and there was some laughter. "I'll take him." Eleanor was as surprised as anyone that the words had come out of her own mouth. The crowd turned. She had not planned to speak. She had not planned anything past finding water and deciding what to do next. But the words were out, and they were hers, and she did not take them back. Nathan Walker looked at her. He looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected, not unkindly, but carefully trying to understand what he was seeing. She was a stranger. She was a woman. She was standing at his fence in a worn dress with road dust on her boots, and no companion, and no visible means of anything. "I'm sorry," he said. "I said I'll take him," Eleanor said. She was already moving along the fence toward the gate. "I'll give you what I have for him." Caleb Stone stepped forward. "Ma'am, that horse put a man in the doctor's office yesterday. He ain't suitable for—" "What do you have?" Nathan said, and his voice had a quality to it that she noticed he had overridden Caleb without looking at Caleb, and he had done it naturally as a man does, who is not accustomed to being redirected. Eleanor reached into her dress pocket and took out the silver dollar. She held it up where he could see it. The crowd was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then it was not quiet at all. The laughter came in waves, overlapping men, slapping each other's arms. One woman covering her mouth and shaking her head. Not cruel in the way that cruelty is sometimes sharp and directed. This was the laughter of a crowd that had found something absurd. And the absurdity of it was Eleanor standing there with her dollar and her steady eyes and her worn boots, and her claim on a horse that had hospitalized a man yesterday. $1, someone repeated, laughing. "She'll take him for $1. He'll kill her before sundown. You got a saddle to go with that dollar, sweetheart, or you planning to ride him bareback into the afterlife?" "Take him," a man called out, not entirely unkindly, but not kindly either. "Take him for free long as we don't have to watch." Eleanor kept her eyes on Nathan Walker. He was not laughing. He was watching her with the same careful attention he had given her from the moment she spoke, and she could not entirely read what was behind it, but she could see that it was something more considered than what the people around him were doing. "What's your name?" he said. "Eleanor Hayes." "You have experience with horses, Mrs. Hayes." "I grew up with them," she said. "My father trained them for 20 years in Ohio. I started working with them when I was 6 years old." "This ain't Ohio," Caleb said, "and this ain't some Greenbroke farm horse. This animal is—" "I can see what he is," Eleanor said, and she looked at Caleb Stone for the first time briefly without flinching, and then looked back at Nathan. "I can also see what he isn't. He isn't mean. He's afraid. Those aren't the same thing." Caleb's expression shifted in a way she didn't have time to fully catalog, but she noted it. She filed it away. Nathan Walker looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the horse. Thunder had come to the center of the pen again, and stood there, sides still heaving. But for a moment, just a moment, he had stopped moving. He had his head turned in Eleanor's direction. She didn't know if he was looking at her specifically or just at the new shape at the fence. But the horse was still, and in all the time she had been standing there, he had not been still. $1, Nathan said slowly. "Everything I have," Eleanor said. He looked at her a moment longer. Then he said, "Deal." The crowd groaned. Some laughed again. A few people shook their heads like they were watching something they would talk about later at supper, as an example of how things went wrong when you let strangers make decisions. Caleb said, "Nathan, get the gate," Nathan said. Caleb's jaw closed hard. He looked at Eleanor with an expression she recognized, not the open hostility of someone who said what they thought, but the flatter, quieter expression of someone who had decided to think it instead and wait. The gate swung open. Eleanor walked in. The crowd went very quiet. Thunder swung toward her immediately. He didn't charge, not quite, but he moved toward her in the way a frightened animal moves toward a new threat testing, trying to determine whether this new thing in his space was going to make his situation worse, or whether it offered some other option he hadn't calculated yet. He was close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, could hear the shaking quality of his breath. She stopped walking. She did not raise her hands. She did not make herself big. She did not look directly at him, not into his eyes, not confrontationally, but off to the side, enough to see his body in her peripheral vision, without presenting the direct challenge of a stare. Her hands hung loose at her sides. She breathed slowly. She made herself as small as her body could be, while still standing upright and present. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you don't trust this. I wouldn't either." Thunder stopped. His ears moved forward. The white ring around his eye was still there, but it was thinner. She waited. "Nobody's going to put a rope on you today." she said in the same low voice she had used to talk her father's most difficult horses down from the edge of themselves back home in Ohio. "I'm just standing here. You don't have to do anything." From outside the fence, not a single person spoke. She heard later that some of them held their breath. She stood in that pen for 11 minutes without moving, without speaking after those first few sentences, without doing anything except being a quiet and non-threatening presence. She let the horse circle her once. She let him come close enough to sniff her shoulder and then pull back. She did not flinch when he did. She did not reach for him. When he finally dropped his head slowly like a man setting down something heavy and blew out a long, shuddering breath, Eleanor exhaled too. She turned her head just slightly toward Nathan Walker, who was standing at the fence with his hands wrapped around the top rail and his expression doing something she couldn't fully name. "He needs water," she said. "Fresh water, not from the main trough. And he needs the other horses out of his line of sight for a while. He can hear them, and it's adding to his anxiety." Nathan blinked. He turned to the nearest ranch hand and said without hesitation, "You heard her." Caleb Stone stood slightly apart from the rest, and Eleanor noticed, because she had already learned to notice Caleb Stone, that he did not move to help. He just watched. Over the next several days, Red Valley watched Eleanor Hayes with the fascination people reserve for things they cannot explain. She did not ride Thunder. She did not try to. She came to his pen every morning before the sun got high, and she sat outside the fence at first, then inside, then closer. And she talked to him the way she had heard her father talk to horses, not in commands, not in the sharp syllables of training, but in the ordinary language of someone present with another living thing. She told him about Ohio. She told him about the road she had traveled. She told him once about James, her husband who had died of fever 6 weeks into their journey west, and whom she had buried herself by the side of the road in Nebraska, because there was no one else to do it, and the ground wasn't going to wait. She did not talk about James to anyone else in Red Valley. But she told Thunder because Thunder wouldn't tell anyone, and because she had been carrying it alone for long enough that it needed somewhere to go. The hands watched her, most of them with skepticism, some with grudging curiosity. One of them, a young man named Pete, who was maybe 20 and had the earnest quality of someone who still believed most things could be understood, if you paid enough attention, started bringing her water without being asked and lingering sometimes to watch what she did. "How do you know he ain't going to turn on you?" Pete asked her one morning. "I don't know for certain," she said, "but I know he hasn't. That ain't much of a reason." "It's the only reason there ever is with anything," she said. "You don't know for certain. You go anyway." Pete thought about that. He had the look of someone filing it away. Nathan Walker began appearing at the fence. He didn't make a production of it. He wasn't there every day. But she would look up sometimes, and he would be standing back near the corner post with a coffee cup or without one watching. Not watching her in the way of a man making an assessment of a woman. It wasn't that kind of watching. It was the watching of someone who had found something he didn't know how to categorize and had decided quietly to keep looking until it made sense. She acknowledged him the first few times with a nod. He acknowledged her back. They did not speak beyond brief, practical exchange for the better part of that first week. Then, one evening later than she usually stayed, when the light had gone orange and long, and the heat had broken slightly, and Thunder was standing near her without trembling for the first time. Just standing. Breathing. Present, Nathan Walker walked around to the gate and came inside. He stood at a respectful distance. He had taken his hat off. She wasn't sure if that was deliberate or habit, but she noticed it. "He's different," Nathan said. He wasn't asking. He was saying it with the same tone a man uses when he sees something he expected to remain one way, become another way entirely. "He's the same," Eleanor said. "He's just not afraid right now." "I've had 4 men try to work with him," Nathan said. "Good men. Experienced men. None of them. They were trying to make him into something," she said. "I'm not trying to make him into anything." Nathan was quiet for a moment. He turned his hat in his hands a slow turn and looked at Thunder, who had turned his head to regard the newcomer with ears that were tipped forward rather than flat. "Where'd you come from?" Nathan said. "Before here." "Ohio originally," she said. "Then East Kansas for a few years. Then," she paused. "Then West." He heard what she didn't say. She saw it in the small adjustment of his expression, the careful settling. "You traveling alone," he said. "I am now," she said. He nodded once slowly. He did not ask any more about it. "You have a place to stay," he said instead. "Mrs. Tillman's," she said. "I'm helping with laundry for the room." "That's hard work in this heat." "Most work is," she said. He almost smiled. Not quite, it didn't make it all the way, but something at the corner of his mouth suggested the shape of one. "You want to keep working with him," Nathan said. "Thunder. I'll pay you for your time." Eleanor looked at the horse. Thunder had lowered his head again, and was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him along her arm. "I'd like to keep working with him," she said. "I don't need much." "I wasn't planning to offer much," Nathan said, and this time, whatever was at the corner of his mouth made it all the way. It was the first time she had seen him come close to something lighter than the weight he seemed to carry constantly, and it lasted only a moment, and then it was gone. But she noticed it. She noticed it the way you notice the first small crack in a thing that has been sealed for a long time, not because you expect it to break open immediately, but because you understand what cracks mean. What Eleanor didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known in those first days, was that Nathan Walker's weight was the kind that had a specific shape and a specific date attached to it. 3 years back. A winter that came early and hard. A wife named Clara, who had been slight and strong and full of some quality that Nathan had never found the right word for, and a baby girl who had not survived the night she was born. Nathan Walker had not left the ranch for 3 months after. He had gotten up every morning because the cattle needed feeding, and the hands needed paying, and the work did not stop for grief. But there was a version of Nathan Walker that had simply closed a door inside himself after that winter and had not gone back through it. Caleb Stone had noticed. Caleb had been with Nathan for 8 years by then, longer than Clara, and he had made himself useful in the way that men make themselves useful to other men who are wounded, stepping in, managing, handling things that Nathan would have handled before. It was not without affection. Caleb did care about Nathan in his way. But care and control can look very similar from the outside, and sometimes the people who come to manage your pain are the last ones who want to see you stop hurting. Eleanor did not know any of this yet. She just knew the shape of a man trying to keep everything together by holding very still. She knew that shape because she had been wearing it herself since Nebraska. The morning Thunder walked to her without prompting on a Tuesday, 9 days after she had walked into that pen for the first time, when the light was still pale and the ranch was barely awake. Eleanor was sitting in the dirt, with her back against the inside of the fence, and her eyes mostly closed, and she felt the warm pressure of a nose against the top of her head. She went completely still. Thunder blew out a breath that moved her hair. She lifted one hand slowly, the way she had done 100 times without arriving, and this time her palm made contact with the side of his jaw, and he did not flinch. He did not pull back. He stood there and let her hand rest against him, and he breathed. Eleanor's eyes burned. She had not cried since Nebraska. She did not cry now, but it was close. Pete was there across the fence, and she heard him make a sound that was not quite a word, but was clearly something, and she heard footsteps approaching from the direction of the main house, and she knew without looking that it was Nathan Walker. She did not look. She kept her hand against Thunder's jaw and stayed very still, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Nathan did not speak when he arrived. He stood there and watched. Later days later, he told her it was the first morning in 3 years that he had walked out of his house and looked at something, and not immediately felt the weight settle back onto him the way it always did every single morning as soon as he remembered where he was and what was missing. He didn't tell her why, but he told her that, and Eleanor understood enough of what he meant to know that something had shifted, not just between her and Thunder, between all 3 of them. The morning after Thunder let Eleanor touch his jaw for the first time, Caleb Stone arrived at the pen before she did. She saw him from across the yard standing at the fence with his arms crossed, and his hat pulled low, watching the horse, the way a man watches something he's already made a decision about. She slowed her pace slightly, not enough for him to notice, just enough to read the situation before she walked into it. Thunder was at the far end of the penhead up, watching Caleb with that white-rimmed eye that meant his body was already preparing for whatever came next. Caleb heard her coming and turned. "Morning," he said. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing about Caleb Stone, his voice was almost always pleasant, and it almost never matched his eyes. "Morning," Eleanor said. "Heard you had some progress yesterday." "Some," she said. "Pete couldn't stop talking about it at supper." He paused. Boy's impressionable. Eleanor reached the fence and rested her hands on the top rail. Thunder's ears swiveled in her direction immediately. She saw his weight shift just slightly, barely visible, unless you were watching for it toward her. "Was there something you needed, Mr. Stone?" she said. Caleb uncrossed his arms. He had a way of moving that was always careful, always deliberate, like every gesture had been considered a half-second before it happened. "Just checking on things," he said. "It's part of my job. Nathan relies on me to keep an eye on the operation." "I'm not part of the operation," Eleanor said. "I'm just working with the horse." "Everything on this ranch is part of the operation," Caleb said, and smiled when he said it, so it couldn't be called unfriendly. "I just want to make sure what's happening here is productive. Nathan's a generous man, sometimes generous to a fault." Eleanor looked at him directly. "What are you saying, Mr. Stone?" "I'm saying," Caleb said, still pleasant, "that Thunder has already cost this ranch 2 injured men, 3 weeks of disrupted work, and more patience than most animals are worth. I want to make sure the investment of additional time is going to pay off." "It's going to pay off," she said. "You seem very certain of that." "I am." Caleb looked at her for a moment, and underneath the pleasantness, there was something that she could feel, like a change in air pressure before a storm not visible yet, but present. "How long have you been in Red Valley, Mrs. Hayes? 2 weeks. 11 days. 11 days, he repeated. "And you're certain?" "I know this horse," Eleanor said, "and I know what he needs." Caleb picked up his hat slightly and resettled it, a gesture that managed to communicate both acknowledgement and dismissal simultaneously. "Well," he said, "we'll see." He turned and walked back toward the main barn without another word, and Eleanor watched him go, and felt the particular cold that settles in when someone has threatened you in a language that has no words in it. Thunder came to the fence on his own, while she was still watching Caleb's back. She turned to find the horse beside her, nose out, and she pressed her palm flat against his jaw, and felt him lean into it just slightly, and she thought, "I see you. And I'm not going anywhere." What happened over the following 2 weeks was the kind of thing that doesn't have a clean explanation, and tends to make practical people uncomfortable, which was exactly why it made Caleb Stone uncomfortable, and exactly why it didn't bother Pete at all, because Pete was 20 years old and still trusted things he couldn't explain. Eleanor did not train Thunder in any way that most people in Red Valley would have recognized as training. She did not long him. She did not use a flag or a rope or a round pen technique. She did not follow any of the methods that Caleb had cataloged from the men he'd brought in before her, experienced men he reminded anyone who would listen with real credentials. What Eleanor did was this: she showed up every single morning before the heat built, and while the air still held a trace of the previous night's cool, she was at the pen. She brought carrots when she could get them from Mrs. Tillman's kitchen garden, and Mrs. Tillman allowed it, which was most days, because Mrs. Tillman had a soft spot for the situation that she disguised as practical interest. She brought water. She brought herself, and she left her anxiety outside the fence, or she tried to, and on the days she didn't quite manage it, she sat outside the fence instead of inside, and waited until she had it under control before she went in. Thunder noticed the difference every time. "He can feel it," she told Pete, who had become her unofficial shadow during these morning sessions, appearing reliably with her water and his questions. "Whatever you're carrying in here." She pressed 2 fingers lightly to her sternum. "He feels it before you've opened your mouth. Before you've done anything. You walk in there wound up, and he's wound up before you reach him. So you just calm down, Pete said. That's it. That's the method. That's a lot of it, she said. Pete frowned. Doesn't seem like much. Try it sometime, she said. Try actually calming down, not just looking calm. See how long it takes. Pete tried it that afternoon with one of the other horses, a young bay gelding, who had been skittish since a snake scare in June. He stood outside the gelding's stall for 4 full minutes before he felt settled enough to go in, and the gelding, who usually danced sideways when Pete entered, stood quietly and let Pete put a hand on his neck without moving. Pete came and found Eleanor afterward and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Huh. Yeah," Eleanor said. The town was watching all of this with the particular mixture of skepticism and fascination that small communities reserve for things that should not be working and clearly are. People came up with reasons. The horse was just tired. The horse had been drugged, which was a theory Caleb did not start, but also did not discourage. The horse was old enough now that he'd simply run out of fight. Eleanor had gotten lucky was the most popular explanation because luck required no revision of any existing belief about women or horses or the proper way to do things. Nathan Walker did not offer any explanations. He watched. He was there most mornings now. Not at the fence, but close near the corner of the main barn where he could see the pen without appearing to be specifically watching it. Eleanor noticed, but didn't acknowledge it directly. She understood in the way that people who have suffered similarly understand each other, that there was a particular kind of damaged person who needed to approach things sideways, who could not look directly at something that mattered too much until they had confirmed it was safe to look. She had been doing the same thing herself since Nebraska. It was on a Wednesday, the third Wednesday since she had arrived, which made it 23 days in total, that Nathan Walker came and sat on the fence. Not stood. Sat. Up on the top rail like a man who had decided he had the time. Eleanor was inside the pen, standing about 4 feet from Thunder, doing nothing in particular. Thunder was close to her, relaxed in the particular way he had begun to show, lower lip slightly loose. One back foot cocked, ears at half-mast. He looked like a different horse from the one the town had seen 3 weeks ago, and the transformation was visible enough that even people who didn't want to admit it had to look at him twice when they passed. Nathan sat on the fence and watched for a while without speaking. Then he said, "What are you thinking about right now?" It was an unusual question. Eleanor considered it honestly. "Nebraska," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "What about it?" "The ground," she said. "How hard it was to dig in June. It looked like it should be soft, all that grass, but underneath it was like rock." Nathan didn't say anything to that. "I keep thinking I should have gone deeper," Eleanor said. "But I didn't have the right tools, and I was alone, and it took me most of the day as it was." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. She looked at Thunder, not at Nathan. "How long were you married?" Nathan said quietly. 4 years, she said. "We were going to Oregon. He had a brother there with a timber operation. James thought—" She exhaled slowly. "James thought everything was going to work out. He was that kind of person. Everything was going to work out." "Those are the worst ones to lose," Nathan said, and the way he said it was so direct and so absent of any softening that she looked at him. He was looking at the horse. "Clara was like that," he said. "She had this way of she could walk into a room, and whatever the room was doing before she arrived, it just shifted. Not because she made a lot of noise or said the right things, just because she was there." He turned his hat brim slowly. "I don't know how to describe it except that." Eleanor watched his profile. "She died in childbirth," he said. 3 years ago, January. The girl—" He stopped, started again. "She lived about 6 hours. Eleanor said nothing. Some things don't need response. Some things just need another person to stay in them with you. "I named her anyway," Nathan said. "After. Ruth. I don't know why I'm telling you that." "You can name something after it's gone," Eleanor said. "That's allowed." He looked at her then, and whatever was in his face in that moment was something she wouldn't find the right words for even later when she tried to remember it exactly. It was the look of a man who had just heard a door open that he had long stopped expecting to open. "Yes," he said. "I reckon it is." Thunder turned his head and pushed his nose gently against Eleanor's shoulder, and she reached up without thinking and scratched behind his ear. And Nathan Walker watched the horse that had been a terror and a liability and an embarrassment for 8 months stand there like the gentlest animal on the ranch, and he said very quietly, "I'll be damned." "He just needed someone to stay," Eleanor said. And Nathan looked at her when she said it, and she felt him look, and neither of them said anything else about it. But something had changed. Not loudly, not with any announcement. The way things change when they mean it quietly and all the way through. Caleb Stone noticed. He noticed the way Caleb noticed everything, without appearing to with his peripheral vision, with the part of his attention that was always cataloging and assessing and filing. He noticed that Nathan was at the barn more in the mornings. He noticed that Nathan had taken to stopping by the kitchen in the evenings, and coming out with 2 cups of coffee instead of 1, and walking toward the pen. He noticed that when Eleanor spoke in Nathan's presence, Nathan listened with the particular quality of attention he had previously reserved for ranch business, and nothing else. Caleb had been the primary person Nathan listened to for 3 years. He had not understood until now how much he had come to rely on that. He said nothing. He maintained his pleasantness with Eleanor when their paths crossed, which she received without warmth and without hostility, which somehow bothered him more than either reaction would have. He said nothing to Nathan because saying something to Nathan about it would require explaining why he was bothered, and the honest explanation was one he could not say out loud even to himself. What he did instead was watch, and wait, and start quietly to think. The first time Eleanor sat on Thunder's back, there was no audience. She had not planned it for that day specifically. It was more that the morning had that quality still unhurried. The horse settled herself. Settled, and a sense of something being ready that she had learned over years to trust when she felt it. Pete was there as always, but he was sitting on an upturned bucket outside the fence eating an apple, and he saw it happen and later said that it happened so naturally that he almost missed the significance of it, because there was no drama to it, no big moment. She just put her hand on Thunder's back, and then she was up, and the horse stood still. Pete dropped his apple. Thunder's ears came forward. He shifted his weight once beneath her, testing feeling this new thing, and Eleanor sat quiet and let him feel it and said softly, "It's just me. Still just me." The horse blew out a breath and stood. Pete retrieved his apple from the dirt and held it without eating it and did not move for a long time. Eleanor sat on Thunder's back for maybe 3 minutes that first time. She didn't ask him to move. She didn't use her legs or her hands for anything except balance. She just sat there and let him understand that this too was not something to be afraid of. That weight on his back did not mean pain. That presence did not mean punishment. When she slid back down, Thunder turned and pushed his head against her chest, and Pete made a sound that was suspiciously close to a sob, and then immediately cleared his throat and looked at the sky. "Not a word," Eleanor told him. "I ain't saying anything," Pete said, voice slightly thick. "Nathan found out that evening." Pete told him she knew Pete Wood could not have expected otherwise, and Nathan came to find her, where she was sitting on Mrs. Tillman's porch, after supper mending one of the things from Mrs. Tillman's laundry pile. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps. "Pete tells me you rode him," Nathan said. "Sat on him," Eleanor said. "Briefly. That's more than anyone's managed." He was ready. Nathan looked at her in the early evening light, and he had that expression again, the one that was trying not to be as open as it was. "You knew he'd be ready today." "I had a feeling," she said. "You learn to trust feelings with horses, or you don't, and things go harder." "Do you trust them with people?" he said. "Feelings." She looked up from the mending. "Less automatically," she said. "People are more complicated." He almost smiled again. The almost smile that she had catalogued by now as one of the things about Nathan Walker that revealed more than he intended. "I'd like to see it," he said. "When you do it again, if you don't mind." "You can come in the morning," she said. "Early is better, before it gets loud." He nodded. He turned his hat in his hands. He was about to say something else, she could see it forming. And then he seemed to decide against it, and he said instead, "Good night, Mrs. Hayes." "Good night, Mr. Walker," she said. He walked back across the road toward the ranch, and Eleanor looked down at the mending in her hands and realized she had sewn the same 3 inches twice and would have to take it out. She didn't particularly mind. What happened 3 days later was the kind of thing that shifts a story permanently off the track it was on. Nathan came in the morning as she had invited him. He came quietly earlier than she expected while the light was still new, and he brought the coffee 2 cups, and he sat on the fence and watched as Eleanor walked Thunder in easy circles in the pen, first on the ground, with a light lead, then without the lead, and then she stopped him in the center and put her hand on his neck and looked over at Nathan. "Come in," she said. Nathan set down the coffee cups on the fence post. "He's not going to like that." "He'll let you if I'm here," she said. "Move slow and don't make yourself big." Nathan climbed the fence slowly the way she had told him and stood inside the pen. Thunder's head came up immediately, ears sharp, that old readiness flickering through his body. Eleanor put her hand flat on his neck and felt the tension in him and said, "Easy, he's all right, he's with me." Nathan stood completely still. Thunder's ears moved. He looked at Nathan the way he had looked at Eleanor in those first days, trying to read the shape of the threat, trying to understand what this new thing intended. "Talk to him," Eleanor said. "Normal voice, whatever you'd say." Nathan was quiet for a second. Then, in a voice that was lower and quieter than his usual speaking voice, he said, "I'm sorry I gave up on you so fast." Eleanor blinked. Thunder's ear swiveled toward Nathan. "That's actually what you're saying," Eleanor said. "You said, 'Say whatever I'd say,'" Nathan said. Thunder took 1 step toward Nathan, then another. Nathan held his ground. His hands were at his sides, and Eleanor could see the effort in him, the deliberate keeping. Still the same discipline she exercised every morning, but that didn't come naturally yet to a man who had spent 3 years managing his life through controlled forward motion. Thunder stopped 2 feet from Nathan and extended his nose. Nathan lifted his hand slow, and the horse's nose touched his palm. Nathan exhaled. It was the kind of exhale that comes from somewhere deep. Not relief exactly, but something releasing that had been held a long time. Eleanor watched his face and saw something in it that she recognized from her own reflection in Mrs. Tillman's washroom mirror on a particular morning about 2 weeks in, when she had looked at herself and realized the thing she had been bracing for constantly since Nebraska. The next thing going wrong, the next loss. The ground falling away again had not happened that day. Or the day before. Or the day before that. "He's something," Nathan said quietly, hand still against Thunder's nose. "He always was," Eleanor said. Nathan looked at her over the horse's lowered head. "So were you," he said. "From the first day." Eleanor did not answer that immediately. She was quiet for a moment in the way that she had learned to be quiet, not uncomfortable, not evasive, just giving things the space they needed. Then she said, "You didn't know me the first day." "No," he said. "But I saw you, standing there with your dollar not flinching while 40 people laughed at you." He paused. "Most men I know would have flinched." She felt something she had not felt in a long time, not warmth exactly, because warmth was too simple a word for it. It was more like the particular quality of light that comes into a room when a shutter has been opened for the first time in a while, when you didn't realize how dim everything had gotten until suddenly it isn't dim anymore. She looked at him across Thunder's back, and she said, "Thank you for saying yes." "To the dollar," he said. "To the dollar," she agreed. And Nathan Walker, for the first time in 3 years, smiled. All the way. Without the qualifier, without the almost, without it falling back into something more guarded. He just smiled there in the pen with the horse between them and the morning light coming in hard from the east, and it changed his entire face, and Eleanor stored it away somewhere safe inside herself, like a thing she might need later. She would need it later. She just didn't know yet what kind of later it was going to be. Because Caleb Stone had been watching from the gap in the barn door for the past 7 minutes. And his expression in that gap in that low morning light was not pleasant at all. Caleb Stone did not move immediately. That was the thing about Caleb, he never moved immediately. He processed first, and then he planned, and then he acted, and by the time he acted, the action looked casual enough that you couldn't always trace it back to the processing that had produced it. He stood in the gap of the barn door for another full minute after Nathan smiled, watching the two of them with thunder between them, and then he straightened his coat and walked back into the barn and went about his morning as though he had seen nothing worth thinking about. But he thought about it all day. He thought about it while he directed the hands on the fence repair in the north pasture. He thought about it while he went over the feed accounts with Nathan after lunch. Nathan, who was more talkative than usual that afternoon, more present than he'd been in months, who made a joke at the end of the account review that Caleb had to manufacture a laugh for because he hadn't been listening. He thought about it in the bunkhouse that evening, while the other hands played cards and made noise around him, and he sat at the end of his bunk with his boots still on and turned the thing over and over in his mind like a stone he was looking for the flat side of. It wasn't jealousy. He told himself that clearly, and he believed it because what he felt wasn't the sharp, hot thing that jealousy was. It was something colder and more structural. It was the feeling of a man who has organized his entire life around a particular arrangement, discovering that the arrangement is being altered without his input. Nathan had needed him. That was the foundation of everything. Nathan had needed someone steady beside him after Clara. Someone who could make decisions when Nathan couldn't, someone who understood the ranch and the men and the town and could manage all of it while Nathan was somewhere else inside himself. Caleb had been that person. He had been good at being that person. He had, if he was honest with himself in the low light of the bunkhouse, come to need being needed in a way that had quietly become the center of his own life. And now Nathan was smiling again. And it wasn't because of Caleb. He thought about Eleanor Hayes. He cataloged her carefully and dispassionately the way he cataloged everything. A widow, no money, no connections. A talent with horses that was real. He was practical enough to admit that even now, but that was all she had. She had walked into Red Valley with $1 and a story, and she had somehow in less than a month positioned herself at the center of everything that mattered to Nathan Walker, that Caleb decided was the problem that needed solving. He didn't decide to destroy her. He would have rejected that word. What he decided was to correct the situation, to restore the proper balance of things, to remind Nathan and the town and Eleanor herself, if necessary, of what was real and what was temporary. He just needed the right moment. The right moment came 11 days later, and it came from a direction even Caleb hadn't anticipated, which meant that when he used it, he could use it with clean hands. The Denton brothers had been a problem in Red Valley for 2 years. There were 3 of them: Roy, who was the oldest, and the one with the ideas, Frank, who executed the ideas, and Little Denton, whose real name was George, but who had been called Little Denton since childhood because he'd been small and had never caught up. They worked sometimes and stole the rest of the time, and the sheriff, a man named Briggs, who was competent but under-resourced, had been trying to build a case against them for 18 months without quite getting there. What the Denton brothers did on a Thursday night in the 3rd week of September was cut the fence on the north side of Walker's property and run off 11 head of cattle. They were not particularly subtle about it. They left tracks that a blind man could have followed, and when Briggs rode out with 2 deputies the next morning, he found the cattle in a dry creek bed 4 miles north with the Walker brand still on them, and Roy Denton sitting nearby eating a biscuit with the specific nonchalance of a man who has miscalculated badly. Roy and Frank and Little Denton were in the Red Valley jail by noon. This had nothing to do with Eleanor, and nothing to do with Thunder, and it was only connected to what happened next because Roy Denton, sitting in his jail cell with nothing but time and resentment, decided to spend that time talking. He talked to anyone who came within earshot of the cell. He talked about Nathan Walker's ranch, which he had apparently observed more carefully than anyone realized. He talked about the widow woman and the black horse, and what he'd seen one morning when he'd been scouting the property line. He talked freely because Roy Denton was the kind of man who found silence physically uncomfortable. What Roy said specifically was that he'd seen someone messing with the black horse's pen on a night about 2 weeks back. Someone from the ranch itself. Going in quiet, coming out quiet. He couldn't say who it was for certain in the dark, but it was someone who knew the property. Briggs filed it away. He mentioned it to Nathan in passing the following week, with the caveat that Roy Denton's word was worth approximately nothing in evidentiary terms. Nathan mentioned it to Eleanor. Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "When exactly?" Briggs said Roy put it about 2 weeks ago. A Tuesday or Wednesday, he thought. Eleanor looked at Thunder. The horse was moving well, turning smoothly on a loose rein, responsive in a way that had taken weeks to build. But she thought about the Thursday of that same week, 3 days after the date Roy was pointing at, when Thunder had been off. Not injured, not obviously distressed, but off. Tight through his back. Less willing than he'd been. She had thought it was weather or her own tension carrying through, and she had backed off and given him an easier day. She had not thought about it again. She thought about it now. "Nathan," she said carefully, "has anyone else been in this pen, other than Pete and me and you?" Nathan frowned. "The hands don't come near him anymore. Caleb said he'd take that job himself, the feeding and the water to keep the traffic down." Eleanor was very still. "Caleb's been doing the feeding," she said. "Since the first week," Nathan said. "He said it was better for the horse to have fewer people coming in." Eleanor looked at Thunder. She thought about the tight back, the off day, the way he had looked at her that Thursday morning with something in his eye that wasn't quite the horse she knew, but that she'd attributed to 100 other things because she hadn't had a reason yet to attribute it to this. She said, "I want Doc Harmon to look at him." "He's a horse doctor," Nathan said. "Not a, I want Doc Harmon to look at him," she said again, and her voice was quiet, but it had something in it that made Nathan stop. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "I'll send Pete." Doc Harmon was a veterinarian of 30 years who had been practicing in Wyoming since before Red Valley had a proper name, and he was the kind of man who had seen enough to be unimpressed by most things, but who took his craft seriously enough to be thorough about everything. He came that afternoon and spent 40 minutes with Thunder, and when he came out of the pen, he had a specific expression on his face that Eleanor recognized as the expression of someone who has found something they weren't looking for. "He's fine now," Harmon said. "Whatever it was, it's worked through his system." "Whatever what was," Nathan said. Harmon looked between them. "I can't say for certain without more evidence, but the tension pattern in his back, and a couple of other markers I'm seeing, the way he's guarding his hindquarters slightly, the residual stress response, it's consistent with mild sedation. Something in his feed or water, maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe a bit longer." He paused. Just enough to make him anxious and unpredictable. Not enough to seriously hurt him, but enough to change his behavior significantly. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight in it. "Someone drugged my horse," Nathan said. He said it slowly, not as a question. "I'm saying it's consistent with that," Harmon said carefully. "I'm not saying I can prove it." Eleanor watched Nathan's face move through something. She saw the understanding arrive, and she saw what it did to him. Not the anger which came, but underneath the anger, something that was almost worse. The particular pain of realizing that the threat had been inside, not outside. That the thing you hadn't thought to guard against was the thing that had already been moving. "Who has access to his feed?" Harmon asked. Nathan said, "Caleb handles it." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Nathan turned and walked toward the main barn, and his walk had a quality to it that Eleanor had not seen before, contained, deliberate, like a man keeping a very precise hold on something. Caleb was at the workbench in the main barn, going over harness leather with a cloth, and he looked up when Nathan came in, and his face did what Caleb's face always did, settled immediately into something readable and appropriate, and slightly ahead of the situation. "Nathan," he said, "Doc leave already." "He did," Nathan said. "He stopped about 6 feet from the workbench. He thinks Thunder was given something, a few weeks back, something that would have made him behave badly again." Caleb set down the cloth. "That's a serious thing to say," he said. "Yes," Nathan said. "It is." "You're not suggesting—" Caleb started. "I'm not suggesting anything," Nathan said. "I'm telling you what the doc told me, And I'm asking you directly, did you put anything in that horse's feed? The barn was quiet. Somewhere outside a door banged in the wind. The space between the two men had a quality that Eleanor, standing at the barn entrance, felt the temperature of. Caleb looked at Nathan for a long moment. "No," he said. "I did not." "Then someone with access to the feed did," Nathan said. "Or the doc is wrong," Caleb said, and his voice was still steady, still measured, still that infuriating pleasant calm. "It could be anything. A plant the horse got into, something in the water. You're going to take the word of a man like Roy Denton, who has every reason to create problems for you, and turn it into an accusation against someone who has worked beside you for 8 years. Nathan didn't answer immediately. Caleb let that sit for a beat, and then he said more quietly, "I understand things are different now. I understand there are new priorities." He paused deliberately. "I just want you to think about who's been here, and who hasn't. Who you know, and who showed up with $1 and a story." Nathan's jaw tightened, and Eleanor at the barn entrance watched him hesitate. It was not a long hesitation. 3 seconds, maybe 4. But it was real, and she felt it like something physical, like the ground shifting slightly under her feet. She had known this moment might come. She had known from the first day she looked at Caleb Stone that this was the kind of man who prepared his defense before he committed his crime. Who built his argument in advance and kept it ready. She had just hoped Nathan wouldn't need it to work on him. She stepped into the barn. Both men turned. She looked at Nathan, not at Caleb. "Ask him about the Tuesday 2 weeks ago," she said. "Ask him where he was that night. What time he did the late feeding. Whether anyone was with him." Caleb said, "This is not—" "Ask him." Eleanor said, still looking at Nathan. Nathan looked at Caleb. And Caleb, for the first time in the conversation, was not immediately ready. It was a fraction of a second, barely visible. But Eleanor saw it, and Nathan saw it, and Caleb knew they'd seen it because his jaw shifted, and his eyes went somewhere, and came back, and when he answered, his voice was the same, but something underneath it had changed register. "I was here that night," Caleb said. "Same as every night." "Was anyone with you?" Eleanor said. "I don't need a witness for every hour of my evening," Caleb said, and there was the first edge in his voice that she had heard in weeks. "No," she said. "You don't. But it's interesting that you don't have one." Caleb turned to Nathan fully. He abandoned the workbench entirely, and he came forward 2 steps, and his voice dropped into something lower and more personal that was clearly intended to cut Eleanor out of the conversation. "Nathan, I have given you 8 years. 8 years of my life on this ranch. I have been here through every hard thing. I was here when Clara died. I was here every morning for 3 months when you could barely get out of bed. I am asking you as a man who has earned something, not to take the word of a woman who has been here 30 days over mine." Nathan was quiet. Eleanor looked at him and saw the difficulty of it. Real difficulty, not weakness. 8 years was a real thing. What Caleb had done through the grief was a real thing. She did not dismiss it even now. But she said, "A person who always chooses silence when the truth needs a voice is still choosing a side." She had not planned to say it. It came from somewhere that was no longer patient. Nathan looked at her. She held his gaze and did not soften it. Then Nathan looked at Caleb. And in his face, slowly, the difficulty she had seen gave way to something else. Not anger, not accusation, but a very quiet, very clear settling. The expression of a man who has found the floor under his feet again. "I want to know the truth," Nathan said to Caleb. "I'd like you to help me find it." Caleb said, "I've told you the truth." "Then you won't mind if I ask the other hands what they saw that night?" Nathan said. "And you won't mind if Briggs comes out and asks the same?" Something moved through Caleb's face that was not pleasant at all, and it was gone in a second, replaced immediately with that familiar composure. But it had been there. "Ask whoever you want," Caleb said. "I have nothing to hide." He picked up the leather cloth and went back to the workbench, and his hands were steady, and his voice when he spoke again was moderate and even. But Eleanor noticed that he did not look at Nathan again. And Nathan noticed it too. What happened in the following 3 days dismantled something that had stood for 8 years, and it dismantled it not all at once, but piece by piece, the way things fall apart when you finally pull out the one piece that was holding the others up. Briggs came out to the ranch. He talked to the hands. He talked to them individually, without Caleb present, and he was good at his job, methodical, patient, non-judgmental in his questioning. What he found was not a confession, and it was not a witness. What he found were 3 separate small things that alone meant nothing, and together meant something that he could not say out loud yet, but could feel the shape of. One hand remembered Caleb going to the pen unusually late on a Tuesday night, and not being able to sleep and getting a drink of water from the pump and seeing him there. He hadn't thought anything of it. It was Caleb's job. One hand remembered a small bottle in the feed room brown glass that had been there for maybe a week and then wasn't. He'd thought it was something for the horse's hooves. He hadn't mentioned it to anyone. And Pete, who was 20 years old and trusted things he couldn't explain, and had been watching Caleb Stone with the particular attention of someone young enough to not yet know that he should pretend not to notice things. Pete told Briggs quietly and carefully that he had seen Caleb standing at Thunder's pen 3 weeks ago at dusk, and that Caleb had had something in his hand. He hadn't been able to see what it was. He'd assumed it was feed. He'd walked away. Briggs sat with Nathan in the kitchen that evening and laid it out, and Nathan listened without moving. When Briggs finished, Nathan said, "Is it enough?" "Not for a court," Briggs said honestly. "Not yet, but it's enough for me to keep looking." "And enough for you to form an opinion," Nathan said. Briggs looked at him. "I've been the law in this county for 12 years, he said. "I don't offer opinions, but I'll tell you that I've been doing this long enough to know what the air smells like before rain, and right now the air smells like rain." Nathan sat at the kitchen table after Briggs left and did not move for a long time. Eleanor found him there when she came to return the coffee cups from the morning. She set them down quietly. She sat down across from him without asking, because he was not a man who needed to be asked anything right now. He needed a person to sit with him in it. After a while he said, "I should have seen it." "You saw it when it mattered," she said. "I almost didn't." He looked up at her. "When he said what he said about you, I hesitated." "I know," she said. That's not who I want to be." "It was 4 seconds," she said. "You came back. It felt longer than 4 seconds." "It always does," she said. "But you came back. That's the part that counts." Nathan looked at her, and there was something in the looking that was different from all the times before. More direct, more open, the sideways quality finally gone. He was looking at her, straight on the way a man looks at something when he has decided to stop being careful about it. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it land. "I know you've been carrying a lot since Nebraska," he said. "And I know I haven't made it easier coming at you sideways the way I have. But I want you to know." He stopped and chose his words with the deliberateness of someone who does not say important things casually. "I want you to know that I see you. All of it. What you've done here with Thunder, with all of it. I see it." Eleanor said, "Nathan, I know it's soon," he said. "I'm not asking for anything. I needed you to know that." She looked at him across the kitchen table, and she thought about James, who had believed everything was going to work out. She thought about Nebraska and the hard ground, and the 31 days she had walked west afterward, because she could not think of a single other direction. She thought about a black horse pressing his nose against her hand in a moment when she had needed it as much as he did. "I see you too," she said. It was enough. For that moment, it was exactly enough. And then the barn went up. Not all of it, not the main barn, not immediately, but the hay storage on the east side of the property caught at 3 a.m, and by the time Pete smelled smoke and ran out shouting, the flames had a 20-minute head start. The sound of it woke Eleanor at Mrs. Tillman's. She was outside before she had finished processing what she was hearing. The bell. Pete was ringing, shouting the specific kind of orange light on the horizon that means fire at scale. She ran. She ran the half-mile to the Walker Ranch without stopping, without her coat, without her boots fully laced, because there was only one thought in her head, and it was not about the barn. It was about Thunder. His pen was on the east side of the property. She hit the ranch at a run and came around the main house and stopped. The heat was extraordinary. The hay storage was fully involved sheets of orange moving upward into the black sky, and the wind was wrong coming from the south and pushing the heat and the sparks toward the adjacent structure where the horses were stabled. She could hear them already, the terrible rolling panic of horses who can smell fire, the crashing against stall walls, the screaming that is not quite like any other sound an animal makes. Nathan was there in the yard, directing men with buckets, shouting over the noise of the fire and the horses and the wind. He saw Eleanor, and his face did something complicated and fast. "The horses are trapped," he said. "The main stable door is on the east side. The fire's between us and it. We can't get to them from this side." "The north gate," Eleanor said. "It's padlocked. Caleb has the—" He stopped. They looked at each other. "Where is Caleb?" Eleanor said. Nobody answered. She looked toward Thunder's pen. The gate was there on the far side, away from the worst of the fire. She looked at Nathan. He read her face. "Eleanor," he said, but she was already moving. She went around the long way, the way the fire wasn't along the north fence line in the dark, and she got to Thunder's pen, and she could hear him, not the terrified crashing of before. Not the earlier version of him, but something different. Something that in any other circumstances she might have called controlled. She got to the gate and pulled it open and went inside. Thunder was at the center of the pen. His head was up and his nostrils were flared, and every muscle in his body was live with awareness, but he was not throwing himself at the fence. He was not destroying himself. He was standing. He turned toward Eleanor when she came in. "I know," she said. "I know you can hear them." She went to him. She put both hands on his face, and she felt the heat of the exertion in him and the steadiness underneath it, and she said, "I need you to trust me one more time. One more time, and then I'm going to stop asking." Thunder pressed his forehead against her chest. She closed her eyes for 1 second. Then she moved. She went up on his back without a saddle, without a bridle, with nothing but her hands in his mane. And Thunder stood for her the way he always stood for her now, because she had asked, and because they had built the kind of trust between them that meant the asking was enough. "Okay," she said. "Let's go get them." And she turned him toward the fire. From across the yard, Nathan Walker watched the woman he could not quite name what she was to him yet, and the horse that everyone had called worthless move together toward the flames. His throat closed. He ran after them. Thunder moved toward the fire, the way he moved toward everything Eleanor asked of him, now, not without fear, but through it. She could feel the fear in him. It was in the way his muscles vibrated underneath her, in the shortening of his breath, in the way his body kept wanting to veer left and away from the heat and the light and the terrible noise of the horses inside. He wasn't pretending not to be afraid. He wasn't some storybook animal who didn't understand danger. He understood it completely. He understood it better than any of the men standing in that yard with their buckets and their shouting, because his entire body was designed to understand fire as death and flight as survival, and every instinct in him was screaming the same thing it had always screamed when the world got dangerous: run. And he didn't run. He didn't run because Eleanor was on his back, and because Eleanor was not running, and because somewhere in the weeks of mornings and quiet words and her hands on his face, he had learned the most difficult thing a frightened creature can learn, that sometimes the person beside you knows something your fear doesn't. She leaned forward over his neck. "I know," she said. "I know it's bad. Keep going." He kept going. Nathan was behind her running, and she heard him call her name, but she didn't stop. The north gate of the main stable was 30 yards ahead, and the smoke was thickening fast, coming low in rolling gray waves, and she pressed her face toward Thunder's mane to breathe cleaner air, and kept her eyes on the gate. The padlock. She had forgotten about the padlock for exactly the 10 seconds it took her to reach the gate and grab it. And then she remembered, and she held the heavy iron lock in her hand, and felt the full weight of it, and felt her mind go very fast and very cold. "Move," Nathan said right behind her. He had a rifle. She pulled back, and he put the barrel against the lock and looked away, and fired, and the sound of it was enormous and close, and thunder shied violently sideways, and Eleanor went with him, staying on through pure instinct, wrapping her fingers tighter in his mane, and pressing her legs in and coming back upright before thunder had finished the shy. And she said, "Easy, easy, it's done, it's over," and felt him collect himself back from the edge. Nathan hit the lock with the rifle stock, and it fell away. The gate swung open. The sound from inside was something Eleanor felt in her chest. Before she heard it properly, the cumulative panic of 12 horses in a burning building, which is one of the worst sounds a person who loves horses can ever be subjected to. It's not just loud. It's wrong in a way that bypasses hearing and goes directly to something more primitive. She rode thunder in. The smoke inside was dense and moving, and the light was wrong orange and shifting and coming from the wrong direction. She could see the first 2 stalls on her left, and the horses in them, a sorrel mare, and a gray gelding, both throwing themselves against the wood, both past reason in the way horses go past reason when they're this frightened. She got off thunder at the first stall and got the bolt thrown and pulled the door, and the sorrel mare exploded past her, nearly taking her off her feet, and disappeared through the gate and into the night. The gray gelding wouldn't move. He was backed into the far corner of his stall with his eyes white all the way around and his legs locked, and nothing Eleanor did in the next 30 seconds moved him. She didn't have 30 seconds to spend on it. She could feel the heat increasing from the east wall and the smoke dropping lower, and she made the decision that she hated making the one where you leave the one who won't move and go for the ones who will. She got the next stall, and the one after that, and she heard Pete's voice somewhere behind her inside the stable. Now Pete, who had not been asked and had come in anyway, Pete, who was 20 years old and still believed most things could be fixed if you paid enough attention. "Pete," she shouted, "the gray in stall too. Get behind him. Don't give him a choice about moving. Already tried. Get low and get behind him and make as much noise as you can. He needs something scarier behind him than in front of him." She moved to the next stall. Thunder was doing something she had not asked him to do and had not expected. He was moving through the stable ahead of her. Not panicking, not running, moving with the specific deliberate energy of an animal who has found his purpose. He was going stall to stall on the left side while she worked the right, and the horses in those stalls, when they heard and smelled him, another horse, a known animal present and not fleeing, responded to him the way frightened horses sometimes respond to a steady one. Not all of them, but enough. A bay mare followed Thunder out of her stall voluntarily the way a horse follows a herd leader without being pulled. Then a roan gelding. Eleanor watched this from across the aisle and felt something that she had no time to feel properly, but that registered anyway, a deep, almost structural amazement. The horse who had been a danger and a liability and a condemnation was now the calmest animal in this building. She was at the 7th stall when the east wall gave way. Not completely. It was a section maybe 8 feet that buckled inward under the weight of whatever had been stacked against it outside, and the fire came through the gap with a sound like an indrawn breath, except in reverse, and the heat jumped 10 degrees in the time it took Eleanor to register what had happened. She grabbed the bolt on the 7th stall and threw it, and the horse inside was already moving before the door was fully open. A big chestnut, whose shoulder checked her hard enough to spin her into the opposite wall, and she hit the wood and went down on one knee and lost 2 full seconds getting back up. Smoke. Low now. She crouched. She couldn't see Pete. "Pete!" she called. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "Here. To her left nearer the gate. Gray's out. I don't know how. He just moved." "How many left?" 2. Far end. 11 and 12. The far end was closer to the wall that had just given way. Eleanor started moving toward it. She heard Nathan shout from outside her name, sharp and high, in a way she had not heard from him before. She did not stop. She could breathe if she stayed low, and she could see well enough, and the 2 stalls at the end were 30 feet away, which was not an impossible distance. She got to stall 11. The horse inside was a young Palomino barely 3 years old. Nathan's newest, and he had gone fully silent, which was sometimes worse than the screaming, because it meant the animal had passed through panic into a kind of stunned stillness that wasn't calm at all. Eleanor got the bolt and got the door and grabbed the Palomino's halter with both hands and pulled, and he came without resistance, just following the pressure, because he'd gone to a place past deciding anything for himself. She handed him to Pete, who had materialized beside her. "Get out," she said. "Last one's in 12, Pete said. "I've got it. Get out." Pete took the Palomino and went, stall 12. The horse inside was an older gray. A horse called General, who had been on the Walker Ranch for 11 years, and who Nathan had mentioned once briefly in the way of mentioning something you don't want to make too much of. She got the bolt. She got the door. General was standing in the back of his stall with his head down and his sides barely moving, and for one terrible second she thought he'd already gone from the smoke, but then his ribs moved, and she exhaled and went in and grabbed him. He came. She got him moving one hand on his halter, and they were halfway down the aisle when the roof section over stall 10 came down. It came down with a sound that was more physical force than sound. She felt it in her sternum before she heard it. A crashing, splintering, cracking concussion that sent a wave of heat and displaced air rolling down the aisle, and General went sideways, and she went with him. Staying upright somehow, not letting go of the halter, and she got one look at where the aisle behind her had been, and understood that the way she had come in was no longer a way out. She looked at the gate ahead, 30 feet. She moved. She ran with General, and she kept her head low and her grip on the halter, and she did not look at the burning sections on either side, not because she wasn't afraid of them, but because looking at them wouldn't help her, and not looking at them might. She focused on the gate ahead, and the dark outside the gate, and the specific quality of the air coming through it. And then Thunder was there. He had come back in. She had not asked him. She had not called him. He had gone back out with the other horses, and then he had turned around and come back into the burning stable for her, and he was standing in the aisle, 10 feet from the gate, with his head turned toward her, and his eyes on her waiting. She let go of General, who bolted forward, and through the gate on his own. She grabbed Thunder's mane. She didn't get a running start. She didn't do it clean. She went up half sideways and got her leg over and came down crooked and heavy. And Thunder didn't flinch, didn't shift, just absorbed her weight and moved forward through the gate out into the night air. She came out into the cold and the dark and the noise of men shouting and horses loose in the yard, and she slid off Thunder's back, and her knees almost didn't hold, but they did, and she stood there with her hands still in Thunder's mane, breathing. The air tasted like the cleanest thing she had ever put in her body. She heard Nathan before she saw him. She heard her name the way she had heard it when the wall came down high and urgent. And then he was there, both hands on her face, his eyes going over her with the specific frantic quality of a man checking for damage, and she grabbed his wrists because he was shaking slightly. "I'm all right," she said. "You were in there when the roof." "I'm all right," she said again. "Everyone's out. Are they all out?" "I don't." "Pete says 11. 12, she said. "I got 12. General was the last. Is he out?" Nathan looked over his shoulder, and somebody called back that General was out, and Nathan turned back to her and did something that surprised her. He pulled her in both arms, without asking, without announcing, and held her with the kind of grip that meant he'd been standing outside that burning building, imagining things he was not willing to name. She let him hold her. She pressed her face against his shoulder, and she breathed, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, and she held on to Nathan Walker with both hands, because the ground was moving slightly, and she thought it was probably better to be holding on to something real. Thunder pressed his nose against her back. She felt it, and almost laughed, almost because she was too depleted for the sound, but the shape of it was there. Nathan felt it too. He loosened his hold and looked down at the horse behind her. Thunder was standing close, not demanding, just present, his breath warm against the back of Eleanor's shirt. Nathan reached out his free hand and put it on Thunder's neck. They stood like that for a moment, the three of them in the middle of the yard with the fire being beaten back, and the horses milling loose, and the hands shouting, and the whole enormous mess of it going on all around them. And for that one moment, none of it touched them. Then Pete appeared with soot all over his face and his hat missing, and said, "All 12 are accounted for. Nobody else hurt. General's got some smoke, but Doc says he'll be fine." "Pete," Nathan said, "you went back in." "I helped," Pete said, with the deliberate modesty of someone who has done more than they're claiming. "You're getting a raise," Nathan said. Pete blinked. "I've only been getting paid for 3 months." "Then you're getting a bigger raise," Nathan said. "Go find your hat." Pete went to find his hat. Briggs arrived with 2 deputies at 3:20 in the morning, summoned by someone in town who had seen the firelight on the horizon. He arrived to find the fire largely contained 12 horses safe, and one notable absence. Caleb Stone was not on the property. His bunk was cleared out. Not entirely. He had not had time for entirely, but the specific things that a man takes when he leaves deliberately, rather than temporarily, were gone. His personal kit. His good coat. The money he kept in the tin box under his bunk, which the remaining hands confirmed had been considerable. Briggs stood in the empty bunkhouse space and looked at the cleared bunk and at the tin box sitting open and empty. And he said to Nathan, "Well?" "Yeah," Nathan said. "He run before the fire," Briggs said. "That tells me he knew it was coming." "That tells me he said it," Nathan said. Briggs looked at him carefully. "That's a serious thing to say." "You said the air smelled like rain," Nathan said. "What does it smell like now?" Briggs was quiet for a moment. "Like a man who made a mistake and ran," he said, which is almost always how they end up caught. He was right about that. It took 11 days. Caleb Stone had gone north, which made sense in that it was away from where anyone expected, and didn't make sense in that north in Wyoming in late September is not a destination. It's a direction, and a direction without a plan turns into a problem quickly. He was found in a settlement 2 days' ride north of Red Valley by a deputy named Holt, who had been circulating the description Briggs had sent by wire, and he was brought back to Red Valley on a Wednesday morning quiet with the pleasant manner fully gone, and something beneath it that turned out to be underneath everything, just a man who had lost control of a plan that had never been as solid as he'd believed it was. The trial was short by the standards of such things, though it did not feel short to Eleanor. She testified. She sat in the Red Valley Courthouse, a wooden building that served as courthouse meeting hall, and occasionally church depending on the day, and she answered the questions put to her by the county solicitor clearly and without embellishment, because she had learned that truth told plainly is more devastating than truth decorated. She described what she had observed. The behavior changes in Thunder consistent with what Doc Harmon had identified. The timing. What Caleb had said to her at the fence that first morning. What she had seen in his face the day Nathan asked him directly about the feeding. Caleb's lawyer, a man from Cheyenne who had clearly not expected this particular assignment, argued that the evidence was circumstantial, which it partly was. He argued that Roy Denton was an unreliable witness, which was true but irrelevant, since Briggs had ultimately found 3 other sources. He argued that the fire might have been accidental, which the remains of a kerosene can found behind the hay storage strongly complicated. The jury took 4 hours. When the foreman read the verdict, the room was absolutely silent for exactly 2 seconds, and then it was not silent at all. And Eleanor sat in her seat without moving while the noise happened around her, and looked at her hands in her lap, and thought about Thunder standing in that burning stable aisle waiting for her, and thought about all the things a person does not know they're capable of until the moment they are required to find out. Nathan was beside her. He had been beside her for the entirety of the trial. Not in a way that anyone could call inappropriate. Nothing was said, nothing was announced, but he was there. Every morning when she arrived at the courthouse, he was already there. He sat on her left, and he did not make speeches or gestures. He was just there, in the way of a man who has decided where he stands and is standing there. When the verdict was read, he put his hand over hers. Just that. Just his hand over hers in her lap where nobody could see it. She turned her hand over and held his. The noise of the room went on around them, and neither of them looked at each other, and neither of them said anything. And it was the most complete moment Eleanor had experienced since Nebraska. And she filed it away in the same place she had filed Nathan's smile, in the part of herself that was slowly carefully starting to believe in things again. Outside the courthouse afterward, the town found them. Not the whole town. Not every person in Red Valley was going to reverse their position in a single day, because people don't work that way, and Eleanor knew that. But enough. A meaningful enough number that it constituted something real. Martha Briggs, the sheriff's wife who had been one of the women whispering at the wash house in those early weeks, came up to Eleanor and looked at her for a long moment, and then said without qualification or preamble, "I was wrong about you. I want to say that directly." Eleanor said, "I appreciate that, Mrs. Briggs." "You were braver than most men I know," Martha said. "In that barn, with those horses. My husband told me what you did." She paused. "And what the horse did." "Thunder did more than I did," Eleanor said honestly. Martha shook her head slowly. "The horse did what you made him capable of doing," she said. "That's something." The hardware store owner shook Nathan's hand and said he'd always believed that business about the drugging was Caleb's doing, and Nathan said, "Did you?" and left it there, which was the right response. Doc Harmon found Eleanor on the steps and said he'd been asked by 3 ranchers in the county whether she'd be willing to consult on difficult horses, and she looked at him and said, "Consult how?" And he said, "However you want to call it." And she thought about that for the rest of the afternoon. It was Pete who said what everyone was thinking, but nobody had put words to yet. He found Eleanor and Nathan standing together outside the courthouse in the pale afternoon light. And he had his hat in his hands because he always had his hat in his hands. When he was about to say something important, and he looked at both of them and said, "You know what Thunder did last night was something nobody's ever going to forget, right? They're already calling him the $1 horse down at Hannigan's." Nathan looked at Eleanor. Eleanor said, "He earned better than $1. He earned better than everything I've got," Nathan said quietly. Pete put his hat back on. He looked between them with the expression of someone who can see something obvious and is trying to decide whether to say so. He decided against it, which was wise, and said instead, "I'm going to go check on General," and walked away with the specific casualness of someone removing themselves from a situation on purpose. Nathan watched him go and almost smiled. "He's going to be something," Nathan said. "He already is," Eleanor said. They stood in the afternoon quiet, and Eleanor felt the weight of the past weeks, all of it, the pen and the barn and the courtroom and Caleb's face and Thunder's nose against her hand in the dark settle into something that was not heavy the way it had been heavy before. It was more like the weight of a thing that had been completed, a thing that had cost what it cost and was now finally on the other side of itself. She had not let herself think past each day for a long time. Since Nebraska, it had been one day, and then the next day, and she had kept her eyes exactly that far ahead, because further than that was too much. The whole long future of it, the uncertainty, the having to rebuild everything from nothing, the not knowing whether she would ever be anything other than the woman walking alone after everything fell apart, that was too large to carry. But standing outside that courthouse in the September light, with Nathan beside her and Thunder waiting at the ranch a mile away, and Pete going to check on General and Martha Briggs, having said what she said, Eleanor let herself look a little further than tomorrow. Just a little. Just enough to see that there was something there. Nathan said, "I want to ask you something." She turned to look at him. He had his hat off. She noticed that he always took his hat off when he was going to say something that mattered. "When this is settled," he said, "when it's had some time to settle, I'd like to take you to supper, not at the ranch, somewhere proper, in town." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "That would take some courage," she said. "People talk. People talk anyway," he said. "I've decided I'm less interested in what people say than I used to be." He paused. "Thunder seems to have that effect, being around something that doesn't care what the crowd thinks." "You're comparing yourself to a horse," she said. "I'm saying the horse is a good example," he said, and the smile came the full one, the one that changed his face. Eleanor looked at it and thought about James, who had always believed everything was going to work out. James had been right as it turned out, just not the way either of them had imagined. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." Nathan put his hat back on. They walked back toward the ranch together in the afternoon light, not touching, not announcing anything, just walking side by side on the same road at the same pace. The kind of walking that doesn't need explaining. Thunder was at the fence when they got back. He saw Eleanor from across the yard and raised his head and walked along the fence line toward the gate, the way he always did now toward her, not away, always toward. And she went to him and pressed her forehead against his and felt his warm breath on her face and stood there for a long moment with her eyes closed. Nathan stopped a few feet away and watched. He had learned by now not to interrupt this. He understood in the way that people understand things they cannot fully articulate that what existed between Eleanor and that horse was something that had formed in the dark, in the smoke, in the first terrifying days of a pen in August, in all the mornings of staying when it would have been easier to leave. It was not a thing you interrupted. It was a thing you were grateful to witness. He was grateful. He stood there in the September afternoon on his own land, which he had barely been able to see clearly for 3 years, which had been a thing to manage rather than a thing to love, and he looked at the woman and the horse, and he felt something unknot in the center of him that had been knotted for so long he'd stopped noticing it as separate from himself. It felt, he thought, like breathing. Just breathing. The way you're supposed to. And across the fence, Thunder lifted his head from Eleanor's and looked at Nathan with his dark eyes calm and clear, and full of the particular wisdom of a creature who has come through fire and come out the other side, and Nathan held that gaze and did not look away. "Yeah," Nathan said quietly to no one in particular, and both of them at once. "I know." The supper Nathan had promised her happened on a Friday evening in early October, 3 weeks after the trial ended, and the town had begun the slow, uneven work of deciding what it thought about everything that had occurred. He came to Mrs. Tillman's at 6 o'clock with his good coat brushed and his hat in his hand, and Mrs. Tillman opened the door before Eleanor reached it, and looked Nathan Walker up and down with the expression of a woman who has been watching a situation develop for 2 months and has opinions about it. "She'll be down in a moment," Mrs. Tillman said. "Come in and don't stand in the doorway." Nathan came in and stood in the front room and turned his hat in his hands, and Mrs. Tillman watched him do it from the kitchen doorway with the specific satisfaction of someone whose read on a situation has been confirmed. Eleanor came down the stairs in a dress that was not the worn brown one. It was dark blue, borrowed from Mrs. Tillman's daughter, who was close enough to Eleanor's size that it worked with some adjustment, and she had done something with her hair that she hadn't bothered with since Ohio. She felt slightly ridiculous, and also underneath the slight ridiculousness, something else. Something that felt tentative and new, and not entirely unpleasant. Nathan looked at her when she came down the stairs and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, You look well, Mrs. Hayes." "You can call me Eleanor," she said. "You've been calling me Eleanor for 3 weeks." "Not in front of Mrs. Tillman?" he said. Mrs. Tillman made a sound from the kitchen doorway that could have been a cough or could have been a laugh. They walked to the hotel dining room, which was the closest thing Red Valley had to a proper restaurant, and they sat at a corner table and they ate and they talked. And it was the first time they had talked without a horse between them, or a crisis around them, or some other thing providing the structure. And Eleanor discovered that Nathan Walker, without the structure, was more than she had seen. He was funny in a dry, understated way that came out of nowhere and caught her off guard. He had opinions about things she hadn't expected him to have opinions about. He had read more books than she anticipated, and remembered more of what he'd read than most people she'd known. He asked her about Ohio. Not about James. Not yet. He was careful about that, but about her father, about the horses, about what it had been like to grow up in a family where the horses were the center of everything. She told him about the first horse she had gentled on her own at 11 years old, a bay mare her father had bought from a neighbor who'd given up on her. She told him about the feeling of that. Of the morning the mare finally walked to her, how it had been the first time she understood what her father meant when he said some things can't be forced, they can only be invited. Nathan listened, the way he listened completely with the full weight of his attention. "She sounds like thunder," he said. "A little," Eleanor said, "but thunder was worse." "Everything about this fall has been worse than anything I've dealt with before," Nathan said. "And somehow it's the best." He stopped. "Chose differently. It's been something I didn't know I needed." Eleanor looked at him across the table. "Nathan," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it's soon. I'm not. I wasn't going to say that," she said. He stopped. "I was going to say that I think James would have liked you," she said. "He had a way of knowing people quickly. He would have seen you in about 10 minutes and decided you were worth knowing. He was right about people that way." She paused. "I think I am too, mostly. When I let myself be." Nathan was quiet for a moment, and his face did the thing it did when something hit somewhere real. "Clara would have liked you too," he said. "She would have watched you walk into that pen on the first day, and she would have grabbed my arm and said, 'There, that one.' She had that kind of instinct." Eleanor felt the prick of tears, which she did not permit, but she felt them. "We both had good taste," she said. Nathan raised his water glass slightly. "We did," he said. They walked back to Mrs. Tillman's, slowly in no hurry, and the night had turned cold, the way Wyoming nights turned cold fast and complete, and Nathan took off his good coat and put it over her shoulders without making a thing of it, and Eleanor wore it and did not object, and they walked the rest of the way in the kind of quiet that no longer needed filling. At Mrs. Tillman's gate he stopped and she stopped. "Eleanor," he said. "Yes. I'd like to do this again," he said. "Supper, walking, whatever it is we've been doing. I'd like to keep doing it." She looked at him in the dark. His face was serious and open in a way that she knew cost him something. Because she knew by now that Nathan Walker's openness was not his natural posture. It was something he arrived at by choice through effort, by deciding the alternative was worse. "I'd like that too," she said. He nodded once. He reached out and took her hand. Just briefly held it for a moment, and then let it go. "Good night, Eleanor." "Good night, Nathan." She went inside. She stood in Mrs. Tillman's front room for a moment in his coat, which she was still wearing, and she put her face briefly into the collar and breathed, and then she folded it carefully and set it on the chair by the door to return in the morning. Mrs. Tillman appeared in the kitchen doorway with a cup of tea and an expression of total innocence. "How was supper?" she said. "Mrs. Tillman," Eleanor said. "I'm just asking." Mrs. Tillman said. "It was good," Eleanor said. "It was very good." Mrs. Tillman nodded, as though this confirmed something she had been tracking for some time, and went back to the kitchen, and Eleanor went upstairs and lay on the narrow bed in the small room and looked at the ceiling, and felt for the first time since Nebraska like tomorrow was a thing she was looking forward to, rather than a thing she was simply preparing to survive. Over the next 2 months, Red Valley changed the way towns change after something that rearranges what they know about themselves slowly, and not without resistance, but genuinely. The resistance came from the places it always comes from: people who had been loudest in their dismissal and were now least willing to revise. A handful of ranchers who had laughed at Eleanor's dollar on that August day, and who found the spectacle of being wrong in front of the whole town uncomfortable enough to reframe rather than revisit. There was a woman at the church who said Eleanor had been lucky and continued saying it well into November, and there was nothing to be done about that particular woman except leave her to it. But the genuine change was real, and it was visible. It started with the horses. 3 ranchers from neighboring properties came to Nathan in October separately, on different days, each of them with the self-conscious manner of a man who is asking for something he's not sure he deserves to get, and each of them had a horse with a problem they'd been unable to solve. One was a young stallion who wouldn't load. One was a mare who had been ridden hard by a previous owner and had since become dangerous to approach in the mornings. One was a gelding 6 years old who had developed what the rancher called a hate for fences, and what Eleanor, when she met the horse, recognized immediately as a trauma response to being tied badly and for too long. She worked with all three. She charged fair rates, not low ones, not charity rates, the rates that reflected what the work was actually worth, and the horses responded each in their own time and their own way, and the ranchers went back to their properties with animals that functioned differently, and they talked about it. People listened. By November, Eleanor had more requests than she had hours in the day, and Nathan started making noise about her taking on the East Barn as a proper training facility, which would require some modification to the structure and some additional equipment, and would represent a commitment to Red Valley that was different from the kind of commitment that came with renting a room at Mrs. Tillman's. Eleanor thought about it for a week. She thought about what it meant to commit to a place when you had spent the previous year treating everywhere as temporary. She thought about the East Barn and what it could become. She thought about the horses that would come and what she would do with them. She thought about mornings in Red Valley, which she had discovered she had strong feelings about the quality of the light, the smell of it, the way the day came in over the eastern hills, in a way that was different from Ohio and different from Kansas, and was purely and specifically here. She told Nathan yes. He built the modification to the East Barn in November with Pete's help and the help of 2 other hands, and Pete threw himself into it with the energy of someone who has found a project worthy of his full attention. And the work was done in 3 weeks, and on the first morning, Eleanor used the new facility. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the space around her, and felt something she had not felt standing in any space since she'd left Ohio. Like it was hers, not belonging to her in the legal sense. It was Nathan's barn on Nathan's land, and she was clear-eyed about that. But hers, in the way that matters more than legal, the way that means you have put yourself into a place, and the place has received you. Thunder was in the first stall. He had the largest stall in the barn, which Pete had arranged deliberately, and which Eleanor pretended not to notice Pete arranging, and the stall had a door that could be opened from the inside, so Thunder could move into the small attached paddock when he wanted to, which was something Eleanor had specified. He shouldn't have to wait for someone to let him out, she had said. Pete had understood immediately. Nathan had looked at her and said, "That's a good principle for most things." She had said, "I know." December came, and with December came the particular stillness of a Wyoming winter, which was not the soft stillness of snowfall in a place that gets it gently, but the hard, clear, cold stillness of a place where winter means something. The work slowed with the weather, the way ranch work always does, and the days got short and the nights got long, and Eleanor found that the long evenings at Nathan's kitchen table, because she was there most evenings now, not by announcement, but by accumulation each evening leading to the next, in the way that things do, when they're going where they're going, were among the best hours she had spent in longer than she could precisely calculate. They talked. They read. Nathan had books, and she had opinions about the books, and he had opinions about her opinions, and they disagreed enough to be interesting, and agreed enough to be comfortable, and sometimes they sat in comfortable quiet for long stretches, and the comfortable quiet was also good. Pete joined them sometimes on the evenings when he wasn't with the other hands, and he was trying to learn to read better. He could read, but slowly, haltingly, without having had much schooling, and Eleanor had begun helping him with it without calling it what it was, just reading aloud, and then having him follow along and then having him try passages on his own, and Pete worked at it with the same focused diligence he brought to everything. One evening, Pete looked up from the page he was working through and said, "How come you didn't leave?" After James died. Most people would have turned back. The question landed in the quiet of the kitchen and sat there. Eleanor considered it honestly. "I thought about it," she said. "Plenty. But I didn't know what I was going back to any more than I knew what was ahead. At least ahead was somewhere James and I had decided on together. Going back felt like deciding that the deciding had been wrong, and I didn't want to decide that." Pete thought about this. Nathan was watching Eleanor from across the table. "You kept going because stopping would have been a different kind of giving up," Pete said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "That's it exactly." Pete nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he was filing something. Then he went back to the page. Nathan didn't say anything, but she felt him looking, and she looked back, and there was a fullness in the exchange that words would have reduced. It was on a Sunday evening in December with snow coming down and the kitchen warm, and Pete having gone back to the bunkhouse an hour before that. Nathan said what he had been building toward for weeks, maybe months, in the careful way of a man who does not say important things until he is certain of them. He said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that whatever your answer is, nothing changes. Nothing has to change." Eleanor set down her cup. "All right," she said. "I want to know if you'd consider if you'd be willing to think about—" He paused. He had both hands flat on the table, and he looked at them, and then he looked at her. "Staying," he said. "Not just the barn, not just the work. Staying. As my wife, if that's something you could, if that's something that makes sense to you." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor looked at Nathan Walker at the lines of him that she had memorized by now, the set of his jaw and the way his eyes went direct when something mattered to him, and the hands that were flat on the table because he was keeping them still, keeping himself still, giving her the full space of the question without pressing into it. She thought about the day she had walked into Red Valley with $1. She thought about standing at that fence watching a terrified horse circle, and knowing in the specific way of knowing that her body did before her mind had finished the thought that she was going to go in. She thought about Nebraska and the hard ground and the 31 days west. She thought about the east barn being hers in the way that mattered. She thought about Thunder who had gone through fire to come back for her. She said, "Nathan." "Yeah," he said, quiet. "I stopped thinking of this as temporary sometime in October," she said. "I didn't say anything because I wasn't sure what to do with it yet." He exhaled. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That's a yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands, and he held them without moving for a long moment, and his face was doing the thing it did when something hit somewhere real, and this time he did not try to contain it, and she was glad of that, because she was not containing it either. "All right," he said, quietly, like a man setting something down after carrying it a long way. "All right," she said back. The wedding was in March, when the ground had softened enough to feel like promise again, and the light had started coming back in the long Wyoming way that made the afternoons feel like gifts. It was a small thing, the church, the reverend, a handful of people who had earned the right to be there. Mrs. Tillman sat in the front row with her good hat on and the expression of a woman who had known how this was going to end since approximately the third week of August. Pete stood beside Nathan with his hat clean and his hair flattened and a look of concentrated seriousness that lasted through the whole ceremony and dissolved into a grin the moment the Reverend pronounced them. Doc Harmon was there. Briggs and his wife Martha were there. 3 of the ranchers whose horses Eleanor had worked with were there, and they sat in the back and nodded in the way of men who are acknowledging something they are glad exists in the world. After Eleanor went to the barn before the supper that Mrs. Tillman had organized at the ranch house, she went in her wedding dress, which was cream-colored and already had a smudge on the hem from the walk across the yard, and she opened Thunder's stall door and went inside and pressed her forehead against his and stood there in the quiet. Thunder breathed. She breathed. "We made it," she said. "You and me. We made it." Thunder shifted his weight. That particular settling she knew as well as her own, the dropping of tension, the loosening through his back, the exhale that meant the world was exactly as it should be. Nathan appeared in the stall doorway. He looked at his wife in her wedding dress with her forehead against the horse, and his face was the face of a man looking at the thing he values most in the world. "Pete's threatening to cry," Nathan said. "Pete's been threatening to cry since August," Eleanor said. "He never does." "Today might be the day," Nathan said. She lifted her head and looked at Nathan, and he was smiling the full smile, the one she had counted and catalogued and stored away since the first time she saw it. She smiled back. Then she walked out of the stall and took Nathan's hand, and they went into the afternoon together. And behind them, Thunder watched them go with his dark eyes calm and clear, and full of something that looked, if you were the kind of person who believed in such things, a great deal like satisfaction. The years that came after were what years are when you have built something real full and sometimes hard and not without loss, and better than anything that had come before. The East Barn became something people talked about in 3 counties. Eleanor's name spread the way reputations spread when they are founded on actual results, slowly at first, through the people whose problems she had solved through ranchers, telling other ranchers the way ranchers do, and then faster, and then it was simply known. If you had a horse that nobody else could reach, you went to Eleanor Walker in Red Valley. You went, and you paid what she asked, and you left your horse, and you came back. In the time she said to come back, and what you found when you came back was a different animal. Not a broken animal, not a forced animal. An animal who had been met where it was and invited somewhere better. She never called what she did training. When people asked her what her method was, she thought about her answer carefully the same way every time. "I stay," she said. "That's most of it. I stay when the easy thing is to leave." People wrote that down. More than once someone wrote it down while she was saying it, and she found that both strange and not strange, because she had heard her father say versions of it her whole childhood, and had never thought it remarkable. And then she had lost James, and lost everything, and walked 31 days west, and stood in front of a terrified horse with $1, and discovered that it was perhaps the most remarkable thing she knew. Pete learned to read fluently by the following spring. He went on to manage the East Barn operation with a capability that still sometimes surprised Eleanor. Not because she hadn't expected great things from him, but because greatness tends to arrive in forms you didn't specifically predict. He married a girl from the settlement east of town in 1885, a steady and intelligent woman named Ada, who had equally little patience for nonsense, and who got along with Eleanor from the first afternoon they spent together. And Ada said later that she had decided Pete was worth marrying partly because of the way he talked about Eleanor and Nathan and Thunder, because a man who had been taught by good people, she said, was a man who knew what good looked like. Briggs closed the case on Caleb Stone in the spring of 1883, when Caleb pled down from arson to malicious mischief and destruction of property, which Briggs found unsatisfying from a legal standpoint, and Eleanor found unsatisfying from every standpoint. But the sentence was real, 2 years, and it was served, and what came after it was Caleb's to manage, and Eleanor did not spend more than the necessary amount of time thinking about it. She had things to tend to that mattered more than the man who had tried to take them away. Nathan expanded the ranch in 1884, buying the adjacent property from a family that was moving north, and it doubled what they worked and what they owed and what they stood to have. And Eleanor signed the papers beside Nathan with her own pen, because what was built here was built by both of them, and the papers ought to say so. Nathan had suggested it without her asking. She had looked at the papers with her name alongside his, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being correctly ordered. Thunder lived another 12 years after the summer of 1882. He lived to be an old horse gray around the muzzle and slower through his joints, but with eyes that retained their particular quality. Until the end, the darkness and the depth of them, the way they could hold your gaze and give you back something that felt like being truly seen. He never threw a rider again. He never harmed a person again. He was gentle in a way that people who had known his early reputation found almost impossible to reconcile with the animal they were looking at, and Eleanor never tried to explain it to those people, because the explanation was not a short one. The children who grew up in Red Valley in the 1880s grew up hearing about Thunder the way children grow up, hearing about things that have become woven into the fabric of where they live. They knew the story, the widow, the dollar, the horse. Nobody wanted the fire, the way they knew other stories that a place tells itself in order to understand what it is. And when they got older and asked Eleanor directly, the way children ask directly, when they have finally decided they are old enough to hear the real version, she told them. She told them about Ohio and her father and the bay mare. She told them about James and the road west and Nebraska and the hard ground. She told them about the day she walked into Red Valley with $1 silver and 1 bag and no plan except to keep going, and saw a black horse screaming in a pen, and felt her feet change direction before her mind had finished forming the thought. She told them about standing at the fence, and Caleb Stone's pleasant voice, and Nathan Walker's face the first time he looked at her carefully enough to see what was there. She told them about 11 mornings of sitting in the pen before Thunder walked to her. She told them about the fire and riding bareback through smoke and General's halter in her hands in the dark. And then one of the children. It was usually one of the younger ones, the ones who had not yet learned to feel self-conscious about the big questions, would ask the question she had been waiting for. "Is it true you bought the wildest horse in Wyoming for $1? And Eleanor would look at that child, and she would look at Thunder across the fence, older now, slower gray, at the jaw, still with those eyes, and she would think about everything that single dollar had been the beginning of. The barn, the work, Nathan beside her at the kitchen table, Pete reading aloud with his face set in concentration, Martha Briggs saying I was wrong about you and meaning it. The feel of Nathan's hand over hers in the courthouse while the verdict was read. "Yes," she said. "I bought him for $1." The child waited. "But I had it backwards," Eleanor said. "I thought I was the one doing the saving. I thought I was the one who walked in there and rescued something that nobody wanted." She paused and looked at the horse. "But Thunder was already waiting. He'd been waiting before I got there. He just needed someone to show up and stay long enough to find out what was underneath the fear." She looked back at the child. "That horse saved me first. He gave me a reason to stop walking and put something down and let it be a home." The child thought about this. "What about Mr. Walker?" they asked. "Did he save you too?" Eleanor considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Nathan and I," she said carefully, "we saved each other, which is a different thing from either person doing the saving. It's more like," she thought of the right words, "it's like finding someone in the dark who is also looking for the way out. You don't save each other so much as you hold the light while the other one moves forward, and then they hold it while you do." The child nodded. This seemed to make sense to them. Nathan came out of his house then, and he walked across the yard and came to stand beside Eleanor at the fence, and he looked at Thunder, the way he always looked at Thunder, the way of a man who owes a debt he knows he can never fully repay, and has made his peace with that, and Thunder looked back with those dark, calm eyes. "Telling the story again," Nathan said. "They asked," Eleanor said. He put his arm around her shoulders, the easy, settled way of people who have been alongside each other long enough that the gesture has become its own kind of home. "Good," he said, and Eleanor leaned into his side, and Thunder dropped his head over the fence and blew a slow breath against her hand, and the afternoon went on around them, the way afternoons do when the important work has been done gently and without hurry, and full of the specific richness that comes to people who have earned it the hard way and know the difference. The story of Eleanor Hayes and Thunder and Nathan Walker spread through Wyoming, the way true stories spread not through any single telling, but through the accumulation of tellings, each one slightly different, and all of them carrying the same center, the same weight, the same truth. People passed it to each other in the way of something useful, something that holds up under the pressure of actual living. A wounded horse. A woman who had lost everything and kept going anyway. A man who had stopped being able to look directly at his own life until someone showed him it was still there. All of them called worthless at one point or another by people who were looking at the surface and calling it the whole. All of them only in need of one person willing to stay, because the world gives up quickly. That is one of the things the world does. It sees the fear and calls it dangerous. It sees the grief and calls it broken. It sees the woman with $1 and the worn boots and the road dust on her hem, and it laughs and steps back and waits for the failure it has already decided on. But Eleanor Hayes walked into the pen anyway. She stayed. And everything that was supposed to be over turned out to be just beginning. That is the whole of it. That is the truth of the $1 stallion and the widow who bought him, and the man who learned to look at his own life again, and the horse who walked back into fire. Some things only need one person brave enough to believe they are still worth saving. And sometimes, one silver dollar pressed into a stranger's palm on a hot August morning in Wyoming is the beginning of everything.